I think at this point it's fair to say that the smartphone industry has matured enough that most companies, except Samsung, who's still trying to figure out how to keep a folding phone from breaking in under 2 years, are pretty much iterating on their existing designs. They're taking what worked and keeping it, and then fixing or improving on things that needed fixing or improving. We saw this with the Google Pixel 6 to the Google Pixel 7, and of course we saw that with the iPhone 13 Pro Max to the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So today, I'm going to be diving into the biggest differences that I noticed between the 13 Pro Max to the 14 Pro Max. I'm also going to be talking about some things that I, as a yearly upgrader, noticed, but if you upgrade less often than that, you might have a couple things that might differ from my experiences, and I'll try to address some of those along the way. But for now, let's dive in to my review of the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So starting right out at the top, phone calls, something that a lot of people seem to miss on their reviews just because it's hard to mess up a phone call at this point, is solid on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. And it has been for most iPhones. In fact, it has been for most flagship phones for at least the past 5 to 6 years. So nothing really to write home about. However, just like when they first introduced the stereo speaker option using the top speaker as a stereo piece for playing videos, having that benefit means that in speaker or at full volume up against your ear, everybody comes in nice and clear. And the recipient of your call can also hear you extremely well. So yeah, hard to kind of mess up a phone call at this point. On top of that, connectivity hasn't really changed. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cellular, it's all pretty much the same. In fact, I have only used the 5G functionality that just got real a few years ago with the iPhone a handful of times in my ownership of the last few iPhones that have supported it. However, I did use it just recently when going up to Gettysburg, which if you're in Gettysburg, they have 5G ultra wideband. Wasn't expecting that, but they have it. Pretty cool. However, when it comes to connecting to those cellular bands, something has changed that really stirred up some controversy, general hate. I really don't know anymore, but Apple removed the SIM card tray, at least here in the US. And for a lot of people, especially techie people who like to swap their SIM cards on their own, or for the carriers who really like to charge for every little thing, changing the SIM card out now may cost you a little bit because certain carriers have limits on how many times you can move your SIM card around if it's an eSIM, and in other instances, it might just be a bit of a pain in the butt if you're trying to activate a phone and deactivate another phone, and they both need to be on some sort of internet connection while that happens. So it's not perfect yet, and it's definitely one of those instances where Apple is trying to push the industry forward with something that seems kind of innocuous, but hopefully in a few years will become a pretty big deal. Granted, even though here in the States we don't have a SIM tray anymore, other countries do still have the SIM tray, and I did find it kind of funny that Apple put a plastic block in the US variants that don't have the SIM tray, and everybody kind of freaked out, but the boards that they use are probably laid out the same way, so they got rid of it here in the States and just put a plastic block in there to save on design cost, and then just soldered the SIM tray where that block would normally be here in the States so that the other countries could have a SIM tray. Saw people freaking out about that. For me, cost-wise, I think it kind of made sense. And actually, before we move on from the removal of the SIM tray, I did want to put in one little personal note, which was that I worked in the smartphone industry for quite a while, selling smartphones, activating for carriers, the whole 9 yards. And when I personally saw the news that they got rid of the SIM tray, I was actually very excited for a couple reasons. The biggest one being that I still remember when carriers would charge people for a new SIM card, and it was just outrageous. I remember charging $15 to $20 to $25 for a SIM card because somebody brought in a damaged phone and the SIM card happened to be a victim of that damage, or they lost it, broke it, it was deactivated for some reason and it wouldn't be able to be reactivated, whatever the case may be. I remember those all being issues, and the cost that these carriers would charge for SIM cards was just outrageous. So not being able to lose your SIM card by misplacing a tiny little thing is, in my opinion, kind of nice. Granted, I've already seen some cases where carriers are charging for more than one transition of eSIMs, which is kind of a crap move, and hopefully that doesn't become a thing. But overall, as somebody who used to activate smartphones for a living, I was glad to see the SIM card go away. However, it doesn't surprise me that carriers are already trying to find out new ways to make money with eSIMs. Hopefully that doesn't become a trend. Anyway, moving on. While Apple did get rid of the SIM tray, something they didn't get rid of was Lightning. It is still on their Pro iPhone. That means that if you're using ProRAW for video or you're taking a ton of these new high-res RAW photos, you're going to be transferring it over USB 2.0 speeds, which is just dumb. Like, even with 512 gigs of storage in my phone, if I ran a ProRAW video, I would only be able to record 37 minutes before filming it. And the worst part is that it would take literal days to move that much of a video file over the Lightning cable to my computer. Apple, you've put USB-C in everything. You introduced USB-C, so soon into the market, back with the Retina display MacBook Pros, that you had to explain what it was. You were that ahead of the curve. Why have you not put it in your phones? You've put it in everything else, just put it in the phones. It's just so dumb. And like, I use MagSafe for almost everything. In fact, I have a MagSafe charger by my bed. I have a MagSafe charger in the office where I work. I have a MagSafe charger on my desk here in my own office. I use that more than I use the Lightning plug because of the fact that it's Lightning. I don't want to keep buying cables. I don't care if you include them. I don't need them. They're slow. And literally the only use I have for a Lightning cable is the CarPlay functionality in my car. That is it. And if I could do wireless CarPlay, you bet your ass I'd do it in a heartbeat. Like, I hate Lightning so much that I'm actually rooting for the EU to force Apple to make their phones use USB-C. That is how much I hate Lightning at this point. So, Apple, get on it, please. Some other things that didn't really change were the design. It's not a big surprise. The design worked last time. It'll work this time. We do have some new colors. I went with the space black because it really reminded me of the original black that we had with the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus, so that was cool. But generally, stainless steel, matte finish on the back. I tried the blue last time, and as soon as I threw a case on it, it didn't matter anyway, so I just went with black this time, and I like it. It's good. I think the stainless steel is always a good finish, and overall, it's a pretty nice touch. Now, moving to battery, this is something that I've always found kind of difficult to test personally because between recording, editing, and posting these videos, I work in an office at a different job. And that is not really a place to burn through a battery because it mainly sits on my desk and doesn't do a whole lot. Even with Apple's new always-on display, which we'll talk more about in a minute, it didn't even really burn enough battery to be noticed by me. And when I drive home, as I mentioned, it's plugged into my car for CarPlay. So that's a charge up moment there. And by the time I get home, it's generally sitting at 80%, maybe 70% if I watch some videos at lunch when I'm at work. But overall, if you're using the battery on your previous phone and you upgrade yearly like me, it's a fine battery. In fact, with the Pro Max, they even pointed out that the Plus model of the 14 was the best battery life. And then as soon as you look at other metrics aside from audio playback, it's actually beaten by the 14 Pro Max. So take that as you will. Now, I will say if you're coming from an older phone like my dad's 2nd Gen SE or even my mom's 11 Pro Max, you may see a considerable battery increase, not only because of the age of the battery in your current phone, but also because it's just a physically larger battery cell. A touch smaller from what I understand than the 13 Pro Max, however. So if you're a yearly upgrader like I am, if you are the kind of person to burn through the battery in a day, you may burn through it that little bit quicker. So you've been warned. All right, so with what I would consider the small things out of the way, it's time to talk about the two big changes, those being the camera and the display. And we're going to start by talking about the display because for me, it's kind of but also kind of cool. Let's talk about it. So when Apple showed off the new display for the iPhone, it has slightly slimmer bezels, which you probably won't notice. It has a slightly higher pixel density, which you probably won't notice. And it's got the dynamic island, which you will definitely notice. But we're going to talk about that in just another moment, because something else that I noticed personally was the display brightness. This thing goes up to 2,000 nits, which seems to be the magic number for Apple. They did that with the Apple Watch Ultra as well. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss that, by the way. We're going to be getting one of those in to review. I'm very excited because I have a theme for that video, so stick around. But yeah, that is also a 2,000 nit display, and that is extraordinarily noticeable in direct sunlight or when you're watching HDR video. But that's about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, being able to see your display that clearly in broad daylight a couple years back would have been a dream, especially before Apple switched over to OLED displays. Those LCD panels were good, but damn, they did not age well when it came to outdoor usefulness. Like, I never found myself straining to actually see the display outdoors, which is very impressive because almost every iPhone at some point has had me kind of holding it and doing this to see it outdoors. Never had to do this on that phone. That is impressive. Another feature of this display that Apple sort of showed off as a really cool and revolutionary thing for the iPhone was the always-on display, and I'll agree with part of it. It's very cool, and the technology behind it is also very cool. However, it's not revolutionary. We've had it for quite a while, and in fact, again, going back to my days working as a smartphone salesman, I remember constantly having to either keep Galaxy phones and other phones with always-on displays from going to sleep and going onto the always-on display, or just cycling them out with new demo units because they would burn in. And this was because even though the different time options would bounce around the display, you're still running the display at 60 hertz, which kills the battery more quickly, and there's only so many places that timepiece can go, and some of them didn't even move the timepiece, so they would burn into the display. What makes this cool on the iPhone is the fact that not only does it drop the display's refresh rate down to 1 hertz, which is something we saw on the Apple Watch a couple years back with its always-on display, but it also keeps a very accurate representation of the colors of whatever you choose for your wallpaper. That's also really cool. Now, one of my wallpapers of choice is bright white, so seeing it try to handle that was pretty entertaining, and I think was the brightest instance of an always-on display wallpaper that I had been able to find, but after a little while I kind of got used to it, and I'll probably leave it on because it's a pretty cool feature. Alright, I've beaten around the bush enough. It's time to talk about that hole punch cutout at the top, also known as the Dynamic Island, which is a dumb name. Apple didn't have to name it, but they always will. So, how is the Dynamic Island to use? It's pretty damn cool, and I feel like it is going to be a very copied feature, because instead of what most companies are doing, which is just putting the camera up over on the side, or making it part of a teardrop notch, or just putting it straight in the middle and gaslighting you on the fact that it's not intrusive like the notch was, this is a feature, not a bug. What I like about it is the fact that it works with apps that are obviously made by Apple, but it also works with apps that are already using the API like Now Playing. So if you're using Spotify or Apple Music or really anything that is a music playing piece of software on your phone, it knows to go up to the top. That is extremely nice. Now the story isn't quite the same when it comes to some of the apps that Apple demoed on stage, but those are supposed to be getting an update, and I'm actually kind of excited to see not only what apps will begin to take advantage of this hole punch cutout at the top, but also what will actually come of the other Android phones that have a hole punch cutout. Are we going to see features that sort of take advantage of it instead of just trying to push it off into the corner, or is it just not going to go anywhere? I'm hoping this doesn't become the 3D touch or touch bar of this generation of iPhone, but time will tell. Hey, so Editor Garrett hopping in here real quick. I was reminded when I was cutting this part together that I totally forgot to mention something in reference to the notch or the hole punch cutout interfering with content. If you watch ultra-wide content, like some tech reviewers who like to make their videos go all the way up to the notch that doesn't exist anymore, at least on the 14 Pro Max, the Dynamic Island will cut into the video. So if you're watching ultra-wide, keep that in mind. Maybe YouTube will update it. However, I feel like that would make the video off-center. I don't know. But if you watch 16:9, as God intended, I'm kidding, but if you watch it in 16:9, any of the content that's filmed that way, it's not going to be an issue. It's just the ultra-wide stuff that a bunch of YouTubers switched over to when phones started getting taller aspect ratios. But if you're just watching 16:9, you'll be fine. Wanted to bring that up. Totally forgot about it until I started talking in the video about the hole punch. So with that, let's get back to the rest of the video. And I'm sure some people are going to point out that I didn't bring up ProMotion, but it's nothing new. If you liked 120 Hz displays on the previous generation of iPhone Pros, you'll love it on this one. It's no different, except for the fact that now the display goes down to 1 Hz, which you're not going to notice unless you're using the always-on display. So that pretty much covers the display. Now we're going to move to the cameras. So we're going to start actually still on the front with the new Facetime camera. The biggest difference with this camera is that it now has autofocus, which I thought last year's had autofocus, but I was wrong. This has autofocus. It is notably sharper, and courtesy of Apple's new photonic engine, this camera and all of the others, spoiler alert, are going to see massive improvements compared to last year's phone. Whether or not the autofocus is worth it is still up for debate. It's had some hits, it's had some misses, and of course if you compare the two back and forth, it's just gonna look like you're putting very similar photos next to one another, at least in more challenging extremes like this demo here. But aside from the new autofocus and the slightly newer camera sensor and lensing, you've pretty much got all the same features as before. You still have the okay but not great if your hair's kind of wild portrait mode, and of course you now have cinematic mode, which also works in 4K at 30 and 24 FPS. Now, I took film classes and I was a study under quite a few different directors, so I personally prefer 24 FPS. No offense, Marquez, but as somebody who went to class for film, that is my personal preference and what I think looks correct. So you can use that, or you can go full MKB HD spec and go with 30 FPS in portrait mode on front and back, and you can also do it on the 14, which has the same chip as the 13 Pro Max, meaning that the only reason the 13 Pro Max can't do it is because Apple software locked it. That's a topic for a different video. You've got it on the front-facing camera, however. And fun fact, going back to the dynamic island for a minute, the pixels in between the Face ID sensor and the FaceTime camera are actually functional, and now they actually show the microphone and the camera indicator instead of pinning it up in one of the corners and hoping you don't really notice it. Or I guess actually hoping you notice it because they're supposed to tell you when the camera and microphone are in use by other apps. So kind of cool that they gave it a little dedicated place between the two sensors in the dynamic island. Anyway, moving on to the back of the phone, we have a much, much larger camera bump. It's noticeable. And in fact, it's noticeable enough that if you are planning on using an iPhone 13 Pro Max case, you'd be wrong. You've got to use the new one. It sucks, and if you're like me and like buying the leather case because it feels good, it ages well, have fun. But then what did Apple do to justify the bigger camera bump and make you have to buy a brand new case to fit your brand new phone? Well, first off, Apple probably doesn't think they need to justify you buying a new case because you should just always buy new Apple cases and give them more money, right? But no, in all seriousness, there is a pretty considerable upgrade underneath of these lenses, the biggest of which is that Apple finally upgraded their main camera from the 12 megapixels that we've been rocking all the way back with the iPhone 6s, yes, that's how long we've had it, to a new 48 megapixel sensor. That is insane. Now with this new 48 megapixel camera sensor, Apple is doing something that a lot of other smartphone manufacturers with high resolution sensors have been doing for a while now, which is called pixel binning. This is where the information is captured by this 48 megapixel sensor and basically binned down to 12 megapixels. Now, this sounds like you're wasting information, however, you're really not. You're still getting all of that light information, color information, all the data that you would expect from a 48 megapixel sensor, but it can be focused in on a smaller, more efficient, more easily transferable over USB 2 speeds file, and it comes out pretty well. However, if you do want to get that full 48 megapixel experience, you can switch it over to ProRAW, which suddenly means that you're getting much larger files and you're also getting a lot more detail. Take a look at this picture, for example. I can zoom so close to this leaf, and it looks pretty damn good. And this is that same image, but the 12 megapixel non-ProRes version. Excuse me, ProRAW. Apple, your naming schemes are very confusing and kind of suck sometimes, but either way, you get the idea. It does give you a lot more data, a lot more detail, but there are some instances where it may not be as useful. It is, at the end of the day, up for you to choose, because if you want to crop in on an image, there is some good news, because Apple actually reintroduced the 2x zoom by simply taking that 48 megapixel sensor and cropping down to 12 megapixels. That is actually really cool. And you also still have, of course, the 3x, which switches over to a telephoto lens that is pretty much the same as last year's, and their 15x zoom is just as bad as it's always been. And that is something that the competition has far exceeded with new telescoping lenses and things of that nature. In regards to the wide-angle lens, we did also get some improvements there as well. We now have a slightly better overall image sensor, a little bit better image quality courtesy of the lens, and in certain lighting environments, it definitely shows, but just like anything, in certain lighting environments, it also kind of looks the same as last year, so your mileage may vary. So between the new camera sensor, of course, the new photonic engine, the new lenses, all of that together, we have a very competent camera setup that is fantastic for photography. Though one thing I want to touch on briefly is that Samsung kind of poked fun at Apple when they brought out the 48 megapixel sensor, saying that they've had 108 megapixels for a very long time. And something I've noticed when it comes to people who are buying things like the Pro Max models of the iPhones is that they are much more aware of the specs that they are buying. Every single person I talked to who had either the 14 Pro or the 14 Pro Max were fully aware that their phone had a 48 megapixel main sensor, and all of them knew how to take advantage of it in one way or another. However, when I talked to the 5 people who are close to me that use Samsung devices, only 2 of them knew that their phones even had a 108 megapixel sensor. So whether you want to say that's because Samsung made these high resolution sensors more common, or whether you want to say that iPhone users who buy the Pro Max would obviously want to pay attention to those details, it's just something interesting I noticed, and I thought it was kind of funny that Samsung pointed that out, and it may have been the first time that some users had even known that their phones had 108 megapixels. Anyway, moving on. Something that Apple has always excelled at is video, and it's kind of no different with this phone. We have a couple new features like the action mode, which I tried out by running across a bridge and walking very sloppily across a bridge, and it smoothed out just fine. And of course, I brought up the portrait, or rather the cinematic mode earlier with 24 and 30 FPS, and it's all right. I am more of a fan of the sort of look you get from the 3x camera. However, you can shoot in 1x and take advantage of the better lens, which, especially in a lighting environment like this, was probably a better idea for a camera like this. But it still struggles with hair, and of course it struggles with finer details, and if it's not quite sure what it's looking at, it just sort of guesstimates. So, not a big surprise. Some people are upset that Apple didn't put the option to record 8K video into their new phones, but between the file sizes of 8K, the slow USB 2 lightning cable, thank you Apple, and the fact that even with Apple's processor being as powerful as it is, even though it's not quite as big of a leap as last year, I don't think 8K video in a phone is really necessary. I mean, believe me, I've seen 8K video coming out of S22 Ultras, and it's not really anything to write home about. It just looks like 4K with more noise. It's not a great benchmark. But even though the iPhone's not capable of shooting 8K, it is still my default go-to for quick grab-and-go shots. And touching on cinematic mode for just another second here, I will probably still not use cinematic mode even though it supports 4K, because with that larger sensor and the better overall aperture, better lens, the whole 9 yards, the natural depth of field coming out of this phone is just that good. And a lot of the B-roll footage that you've probably seen in a few videos was done on my iPhone 13 Pro Max. And that's generally why I get the Pro Max models, is because the video is just that good. 4K at 24, 30, or 60 FPS. You can even do 120 or 240 at 1080p if you wanted to. All of that is fantastic. So it's good. It's always been good. And if you really have a need to use the 2.8K action mode, it's kind of GoPro good, but it's okay. Overall, video on the iPhone has just been a good grab-and-go shooter, which is why I always get the largest storage option. And this year I didn't, because I think a terabyte is a little insane for what I need, but if you think you need it, go for it. If you're going to be shooting ProRAW, maybe. ProRes. Oh my god, Apple, stop naming your things so close to one another. I don't like it. At the end of the day, the iPhone 14 Pro Max is, as I mentioned at the start, a very iterative phone because we're not getting a folding phone from Apple, and overall, what we had last year worked very well. And for those of you thinking that you might want to upgrade from last year, it's probably not worth it because the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max were already very, very good phones in many, many ways, most ways for people using it for photo or video. And aside from the new sensor, and maybe, if you're really into that cutout, the dynamic island, the iPhone 14 is just continuing to polish what was already good and trim off or improve what didn't work last time. So if you're coming from last year, maybe skip this one. However, if you are a Pro user from something like the 11 Pro or maybe even the 12 Pro, if you've used it pretty heavily and the battery or screen have started to show some age, this might be a worthwhile upgrade. Either way, that's been it. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or any comments, leave them down below. I'll try to be somewhat engaged in this comment section for at least the first hour of the upload, so if you got any questions, post them then. Hopefully you guys will stick around. Make sure to like and subscribe. Like I mentioned earlier, I will be posting a video once my Apple Watch Ultra arrives. And again, I got a theme for that I'm pretty excited for. If you want to check out something else, you can check out maybe my AirPods Pro 2 review. I've also done a couple older things, and I'm also starting to post shorts here. So I got a lot of stuff going on, so make sure you guys don't miss it. And aside from that, I will see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there, and have a good one.